7th, 2023 meeting of the Charter Review Commission to order. The first item on the agenda would be to review and approve the minutes. We have a motion to approve the last minutes. We have a motion to approve the last minutes. Is there any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Anybody opposed or abstaining? Excellent. So the other item on the agenda for today is to go through the history of charter revisions. And Kate and Maya have spent quite some time going through those boxes over there. And I think that they are prepared to lead this meeting by telling us what they know about how the charter got to be where it currently is. So I'm just gonna hand it right on over unless you need my help.
No, I think we're good. It started, as David said, with these two boxes, and now it's neatly in that box over there that we are so proud of. We would put a big bow on it. It was an adventure because well, let me go through what we're gonna do. We're gonna give a sort of a summary, and then we're just gonna go summary year by year. We're not gonna go through the whole thing. And then we have lessons learned that I think might be the most instructive for all of us, because we now know a lot of lessons that we've learned. So what we did is, we opened these, thankfully for Patrick, found these boxes. We opened the boxes, and basically the last Charter Commission honestly just threw everything in two boxes. It was
That
not
was the
organized.
1980 charter.
Yeah, 1980 charter, I'm sorry. Yeah, 1980 charter. So we had this big pile of papers. So we went through and we organized them by year. And it really does tell the story of how they started and how they ended. And it all began, there's a sheet here, again, you don't have to follow along, but we did a summary sheet that really just puts down sort of the pivotal or important things that happened. And it all started in 1980 when the select board, just like the current select board did with us, formed the Charter Commission and appointed members. They had a similar process than we did. Everybody put letters. I'm not gonna make any judgments. I'm gonna say, be really clear about this. There were men and women who applied. The composition was all men. That's no judgment towards men, but I just wanna put that out there because it sort of, it plays a part as the years go on. There are a number of draft charters that we have, and you see them listed right there. We have copies of 13 draft charters. So they kept changing, which was interesting.
They are in that box.
Yes.
And we can talk about the organization of the box at the end.
Yeah. So they had the draft charters along the way. And then on the second page is just a summary of the important dates. And these will come into play when we talk sort of about the lessons learned as well. But they met over 1980, 1981, 82. In 1983, we'll talk about this more, is when their work was really done. And they passed it on to the town to vote on it, and then to the legislature. So it was really 80 and 81 and 82 where the commission did the work. And it was finally done when they started. They were formed in January 8th, 1980, and the governor signed it, or it was brought to the governor for signature on February 10th, 1984. So almost 4 years later. So that's sort of the summary of everything, and now we'll just sort of go through and give you a summary of what happened in those years.
Can you tell us what it was before 1980 when this Charter Revision Commission was formed?
What do you mean by that?
Well, was there a charter before that?
Yes.
Yes, but it was,
1946, I think.
yeah. And they sort of
And
made.
we have copies.
Yeah, and what they did is that one, was the 1929 was like our first charter, and then at 46 or whatever it is, they made like not very many changes to it. So these people, this is why I give them huge amounts of credit, they started with something and really changed it, you know? So they were starting with a document that was 50, pretty much for itself, 50 years old.
To clarify then, there was no review commission between 46 and 80.
Not that we know of.
Right.
Okay.
There might have been, but we don't know.
There's no record of it. But when we start looking at this stuff, you're gonna see that all the work that they did, which indicates that there really wasn't anything substantial done
In
was
between.
in between. I think that's why this is a lesson learned, I guess, but we're lucky because we're actually starting with a document. And these people did not start with, really, they started with an old document. So,
We haven't moved the 46 into that box, we should.
yeah.
You have the 1929 one too, or just the 46?
Just 46.
We can get a copy of the 29.
I have some of the old statutes. I tried to scan them and I failed, but, yeah, there's some older ones.
That's good.
Did you find anything between 46 and 80?
There were minor revisions made.
Yeah.
The
They had a town meeting, I know that happened. But
Yeah, but other than that, yeah. So these people really started from scratch.
So you can read a detail for 1980, but I'll just give you some highlights. The first meeting was held on April 11th, and I think that was probably the only meeting in which all the members showed up. And they had a lot of early discussions on how to proceed, whether they should have subcommittees or they should work as a committee as a whole. And they decided to have subcommittees, but we never found any evidence that any subcommittees ever met or anybody was ever appointed to them, which is kind of interesting. They spent most of the year doing a line-by-line review, which they didn't finish until December 3rd. Denise looked shocked.
We plan not to operate that way.
Yeah, no. They didn't have, they had a presentation from the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, and they did seek input from department heads. But I'm not sure we have any record that any of the department heads actually came to a meeting to present anything. And we don't have anything in writing except from the library committee and the finance committee. I think Parks and Recreation sent a little note saying everything is fine. They discussed using Bennington and Greenfield charters as an example. And they started having real issues with attendance. And that was basically 1980. Line by line review.
And I'll step back one second. What's in this box are the minutes to the meetings that we have, the draft charters, and just random other documents that came up along the way. We found no agendas for meetings, which was interesting, which means, I mean, they might not have had agendas, we don't know. And then there are documents that each commission member, you know, some of them you could tell, like, it would be the person's name, and you know that that person wrote that little thing. So this is sort of how we piece this all together, and we say we don't have any evidence that the people that the commission reached out to ever really contributed anything, we don't know. So they spent line by line in 1980, then you get to 1981, And this is when they really started begin talking about the issues that they were sort of tackling. And it's interesting on the things that they decided to talk about. Like right out of the gate, the first thing they talked about in 1981, after doing a line by line, was about the Parks and Rec Board and about the Library Board and their relationship to town government, because they're sort of these freestanding things that get to spend money on their own. So that's what they came out of the gate with. You know, that was the most important thing after just doing a line by line. And this, as Maya said, they did start bringing people in or writing people saying, would you give us your opinion on certain subjects? Again, we have little evidence that anybody ever contributed, or even if they did, it was never in the minutes that they actually said, you know, somebody said something good. We have no evidence of that. They did look at some other charters. They had one public meeting during the entire year, and that was on April 15th to get public comment. And what's interesting about that meeting, there are basically no notes from that meeting. We do know, I think it was maybe 15 or 20 people tops came to that meeting. We never saw any warnings or press releases or anything, so we don't know if that's a function of why only 15 people, you know, showed up at this meeting about the charter. It was also when they really began talking about what the powers of the, and I'm gonna keep saying selectmen, this is what they call them, the powers of the selectmen.
Yeah, I wrote
should be.
select board because I couldn't stand writing select.
But I kept it consistent. So they really started to talk about whether they should be broad or specific. So that, and they finally decided, no, we want them more specific. And that's why I think today we have all those things listed in the charter. It was also interesting that they decided to put the school district and the schools in the charter then. But there's no evidence that they actually asked the schools if they wanted to be in the charter. And they had an idea, which did not make it into the charter, that the school and the town should like have a joint finance department, do a lot of consolidation on, you know, working. They also wanted to put in the charter that the town could at any time get out of the Wyndham Southeast Supervisory Union. I mean, it was really interesting, all of this discussion on the schools, but the schools weren't asked about this. So that was interesting. The one thing, this is a teaser for later, they had a discussion at the end of the year, they wanted to put in term limits for select board members, school board members, and town committees. And that was a big issue, they wanted to do that, have 6-year terms. They had a lot of, again, I think they did a great job, but they had a lot of false starts. You know, when they started in 81, in February, they're like, we're gonna start writing. Well, then on March 4th, they're like, we gotta start writing. And then, you know, by mid-March, they're like, okay, let's
Right.
put the structure, let's put structure and put articles in place. And then they started writing sections at a time. And you know, whether, this is in our lesson sort of, we want to talk about how they did it, and is it the way we should do it. So 81 was really when they started doing a lot of work, talking to a lot of people, and getting their ideas out there, but there is little evidence of much public participation. So that's kind of where we were in 81.
So in 82, they actually had some drafts, and we have a draft charter. And on March 12th, it was actually printed in the paper. There was a draft that was printed. And they had a discussion of the charter at RTM that year. It was really interesting that the big item at RTM was term limits. Term limits was a big deal. RTM also wanted an addition of an item to require the select board to provide ambulance and EMT service. And they did put that in there. And they thought that they could maybe do a final vote on adoption in November of that year. That didn't happen. There was a nice newspaper story before RTM, which we have in the file, explaining the charter and the changes, and there was a draft written of the charter. So in the summer, there was another draft, and they spent a lot of time correcting typographical errors, and you have to remember, word processing was kind of in its infancy then.
There's a lot
And
of
a
whiteout.
lot of the paper, there's a lot of whiteout, and it was all written on that, what do you call it, tractor paper? On a dot matrix printer. So, there were a lot of typos. They had 4 public meetings in May of that year after the changes from RTM were put in the charter. And they had very disappointing attendance, again. We don't know whether it's because it wasn't widely publicized, whether nobody was interested, or what the deal was. But they had 4 meetings, and they counted 25 individuals at 4 meetings. And they counted them as individuals because some people came to more than 1 meeting. So they didn't have great attendance. There's some paperwork showing that they expected to have at least 15 people at each meeting. And I don't think that happened. And then they started talking about how to roll this final charter out. And they had an informational meeting on November of that year, and they had a special RTM meeting on the 6th of November. So you can see as you go through, there were draft after draft after draft. And for some of them, we have a complete charter, and for some of them, we only have the sections that were rewritten. So the year ended on December 13th with a new draft.
And then comes 1983. And by 1983, the commission's job was pretty much over. They looked over the final draft on January 4th, 1983. And then on January 26th is when, because we have to remember the select board has a role in this. So the charter went to the select board, for the select board to sign off on it so that they could warn the public meetings. There had to be 3 public meetings, and those occurred in February 9th, 16th, and 23rd. Those are required. And then on March 1st is when they had the townwide vote by Australian ballot on the charter. And, March 3rd, I'm sorry, March 3rd, not March 1st. And it passed 1,459 to 442. And after that is when it was introduced into the legislature by Senator Gannett, who was from Wyndham County, from here, Brattleboro. And it was, the bill number was S-166. And it was introduced on March 24th, and at that point, there's certain deadlines in the legislature where you have to have things introduced by so they can be taken up by both houses, and we missed that deadline. So it sat there,
For a year.
and there was a lot of back and forth between March 24th. There was actually, it went to the Senate Government Operations Committee, who had a meeting about it on December 8th that the Brattleboro Select Board came to. But between March 24th and December 8th, or even January 1st, 1984, most of it was back and forth between the town attorney and, you know, Bob Gannett, trying to figure out, is this gonna pass, are we gonna have any problems? So 83 was pretty much nothing for the commission to do. Then we get into 1984, and the beginning of the legislative session. It was on the Senate calendar on January 6, 1984. It gets through the Senate, but as it's going over to the House, Senator Bloomer, who is from Rutland, put the brakes on it because Senator Bloomer and the Attorney General were saying that the term limits, as we're foreshadowing, you know, going back, that the whole idea of term limits for select board members and school board members is unconstitutional. So they were like, this is unconstitutional, and Senator Bloomer was not gonna have anything of it. That was like, we're not having any of that. The town, though, and the Charter Commission and everybody in Brattleboro was warned. They had a memo from the Assistant Attorney General saying, hey, you guys, we don't think this is constitutional, but Brattleboro decided we're going for it anyway. So they put the brakes. It didn't end the whole thing. You know, they figured it out. There was an amendment made. So that was January 13th. The brakes were put on it. It went through. And on February 10th, it went through the House and the Senate. February 10th, the Senate voted for it and sent it to the governor for his signature. And on February 8th, there was a story, United Press International, UPI at the time, which doesn't exist anymore, called the Brattleboro Charter a model for progressive government. So we got, and there's one thing that I failed to mention in 1983. Once the charter got to Montpelier, it wasn't a given that it needed to go through legislative review. The legislature and the Attorney General's office, Secretary of State and the Attorney General's office looked at it and said, you know, we're not just gonna introduce this and make it quick. Because of the gravity or the extent of doing what we were doing to the charter, they wanted to make sure it got a proper review. I don't know if you can fast track things. It sounded like there could be a fast track or a slow track. We were put on the slow track. But it really didn't have much opposition. It was really what held it up was this
Term limits.
term limit thing, which everybody had been warned about, but nobody wanted to like do anything about. So, you know, where the commission was concerned, just as a summary, the commission's role was really 80, 81, and 82. And then the 83 took so long because of the timing of the legislature. And then when it got into the legislature in 84, it really went quickly. But again, everything in that box is summarized by year in these documents. It's you know, if you want to go look at something, you know where to find it. And there's a lot of, you know, we're making it sound like it was quick and easy, but there was a lot of back and forth. And in the lessons learned, I'll sort of, one of the things that I think Maya will both talk about is the sort of lack of public participation, the amount of time, like who was making the decisions? You know, was it the Charter Commission or was the public involved? And that's one of the things Maya's gonna talk about next, sort of the lessons learned. And I think from the lessons learned, what we're hoping is sort of, we can figure out what our path forward would be, take the good things that they did and take the things that we might want to do differently from their experience. And we're experts now on their experience, we feel like we lived it. So we can answer any question that you have. But now the fun part is the lessons learned.
I have a couple of
Oh, yeah.
questions,
Oh,
if I
yeah,
might,
sure.
and everybody
Oh, yeah.
should chime in now before we start into this next part of the discussion. First, do you have any sense about who did the actual writing of the charter?
Yeah, it was, Dart Everett did most of the
And-
writing, I believe.
Dart Everett and Norm Runyon.
Yeah.
Norm Runyon at the time was the editor of the Brattleboro Reformer. So they sort of relied upon him on some of this stuff. And that's one of the questions. There was town staff, Chris Hart, who was the assistant town manager at the time, was staffing the commission. But it seemed to be the members of the commission who were doing the writing. And it became an issue, I can't remember which year it was, that they stopped and they said to themselves, wait a second, who should be writing this? Should it be us? Should we be getting more assistance from town staff? And who was writing it sort of leads into the issues that were being discussed, because there were some people, I don't want to call it an agenda, but some people had issues they were passionate about. There was Dart Everett that was really passionate about the school system. So, he was driving that conversation and what that language was.
And Dan Woodbury was really into RTM.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, and it was,
and editing. I think that Dan Woodbury did a lot of the editing.
yeah, he did a lot, and it was interesting because it was almost like if you wanted, if something was really, something you were passionate about, something that you had interest in, you were sort of given that. And there's really no evidence, and again, this is what's weird about it is, Dan Woodbury or Dart Everett or John Burgess did a lot of helping them because he was a lawyer, he did a lot of the writing. And they had a lot of back and forth about the finance committee. We see that it was written by, either David wrote it or Hannah wrote it, but we never see anybody else on the committee or the commission going, hey, we all agree with what David wrote, or we agree with what Hannah wrote. It sort of just appeared, you know what I mean? That was so it seems as though the commission did it less than any town staff, which is sort of, was that the right way to do it,
Then I have a question about your consistent theme that there weren't public meetings or public hearings. So clearly the way government functions now is in the sunshine. And so we notice up our meetings and we're on television and we haven't had a lot of attendance, A couple of people have come consistently to our meetings and maybe we had a couple more people at a couple of the other meetings. When you say that there's no evidence of like public meetings or public hearings, can you then talk a little bit about what that means?
Yeah.
Because it sounds very different from the way we're doing business now.
I think what it means is that this charter really came out of the minds of the 5 guys who were there at the end. And what they presented, what they wrote in the, had in the paper in both the first draft and the final draft was really their creation and their notion. I mean, they did take some suggestions from a few people in town who took the time to write a letter. Jesse Coram was one. He was a local attorney. And they took some advice from some of the comments from RTM. RTM said, well, all these little boards and commissions, you want 6-year term limits and we don't think it's enough, so they did change it to 9. But there is not a whole lot of evidence that they took a lot of advice from anybody other than themselves.
And there's no evidence, first of all, their meetings were at noon time on a weekday. There's no evidence that that they were ever warned. There was one memo that we found that the town manager's office gave to the commission saying, this is what you're supposed to do, all meetings are supposed to be warned. We never saw a warning, we saw no agendas, absolutely no agendas. The meeting minutes, and
We're sporadic.
and they were handwritten so we would think out of all the documents, we'd at least, if they had agendas, you'd think we'd have at least one. There's no evidence of agendas. So I think that's why, you didn't see anything for the public, because they weren't telling anybody when they were meeting. They did have sandwiches at their meetings, when you discovered that. They had sandwiches. And they didn't have a consistent time when they were meeting. I mean, when they met, it was at lunch. And one of the things that was their problem, and that's one of our lessons learned thing, is they started, I should put this folder, it's actually funny. They have a folder where they have, these people were appointed on April 1st, 1980, it's everybody's names typed. And as the years went on, people's names were scratched off and a new person was put on it. That name was scratched off, And we actually have memos that Norm Runyon, who was the chair at the time, was writing to the other board members going, I sat in the room for 20 minutes, no one showed up, if you don't want to be, he was very blunt about stuff. So I think that was another problem. They didn't really have a consistent, and I don't know, we don't really know why. Some of it's evidence that the people on the commission, I think, were being asked to do too much. If you're being asked to write the charter, you're like, I don't have time to write the charter. So there wasn't, I think, it's a combination of what Maya said, it's a combination of when the meetings were, that they probably weren't warned, there were no agendas, so no one knew why you were coming to a meeting if you're a member of the public anyway. And I don't think they did it on purpose. I don't think, we don't have any, again, we have a good thing at the end, there was no evidence they held their opinions back whatsoever. So I don't think, if they were plotting a scheme against the town, we would know it, because they would have written it and put it in that box, based on the stuff
We
we
have, in the minutes folders, there are people's handwritten notes for that meeting. So we tried to do everything in date order. So sometimes they're typed minutes, sometimes they're not. But if there's any clue that there was a meeting, we try to put everything for that date together. And then the charters are separate. Although we do have some minutes in with the charters when the minutes specifically talked about the changes that are in that charter.
And I don't
That
think
makes sense.
and I think it's one of these situations where we can't get away, we can never get away with what they did today.
Yeah.
And that's what I think it was, a product of the actual people on the commission that really, that's how we got what we got, which was a good product, but it wasn't,
Transparent.
yeah.
Yeah, no. It
So I have
was-
some other questions, but Millicent, you go ahead.
Yeah, I was struck by I thought that the amount of votes in the Australian ballot was really low. And I don't know, maybe you don't, because I'm not that familiar historically with how Australian ballots go. But like that total of it was 1,400 for and 400 or 500 against, and for such an important document. So I was just kind of wondering if you learned anything about, well, A, do you have an opinion, is that low, or is that well, that's typical voting? Or, and also, did you learn anything about, how that was encouraged or not encouraged,
We do know that the charter was put, obviously, into the Brattleboro Reformer, because Norm Runyon was the chair. And they had paper copies that were inserted into the paper. But other than that, we have no evidence that it went out any other way.
We don't have any evidence that, there was a postcard mailing, saying, come vote on the charter, you can get a copy at the municipal building. We don't have any evidence of any of that. There was an article in the paper, but I think that was the one that George Carville
Yeah, he wrote.
wrote.
Yeah.
And just talking about the changes in the charter and when the vote was gonna be, but that's all.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I thought the vote total was low.
What
I
was
don't
the
know how many
population of Brattleboro?
Yeah.
About the same, it's been the same for
Yeah,
100 years.
yeah,
12,000.
yeah, I don't think the population is different, that different.
I think that 2,000 votes is a pretty standard number for a off-year election. I mean, this year, you probably had 2,000 people voting,
Yeah.
2023, and so that was 40 years ago, an off year. But, you know, for an election, a presidential election year, you'd have many more voters.
Well, this is like voting not just for like the current thing, but for the next 15 years worth of.
Exactly. But there's no indication that that was ever explained to people either. You know what I mean? It was just, we're doing this thing because it hasn't been changed in 50 years.
Other questions from the table? or from-
Yeah, about the term limits. I guess I was in another meeting where I thought, so I'm not sure if it's to the town attorney, is it not a state? Today, term limits is a state rule or no?
No,
No
I
term
think it
limits.
is.
Just a,
No.
okay.
no, so, I mean, that's one of the things we can look at, if it's a question.
And it was the,
Yeah.
it
It
was,
was elected officials could not have term limits, is that right?
Right, I think that's, I'll have to research that, but it's still a topic today, but I think the legal issue is still the constitutionality of it,
yeah.
so.
There are term limits in the current charter, I believe, for committees.
Yeah.
Right.
So you can't be on
Library and, yeah.
DRB or planning commission, I believe, for more than 9
9 years.
years.
It's the same for parks.
Was it
correct?
9 or 6? Maybe it's 6 years.
It's 9.
No, it's not.
Because it's offset strangely from like what your actual term is. Some
Yeah.
are 4 years, some are 2 years, so like
It's
if you
weird.
serve, you might get elected too, like and not be able to serve your last year.
Exactly.
Elected, appointed, whatever.
Yeah,
Other
But-
questions? Go ahead.
but it was 6 years and they changed it to 9 after RTM, members of RTM said, but what if you can't find people? You know, you have to have longer terms because, you know, you want people to stick around. So,
I have another question, but much more specific. Would you have were there other questions at the other? Here? I have another question that's much more specific. The current charter structure, after the initial article about the organization of the government, starts with the power of the people. And I see in some of your notes here that I was glancing through that it started with the power of the masses.
Yeah.
Yeah, good for them.
Yeah.
But in the early versions, it's later on in the charter, at least in these early notes.
Yeah.
Do you know when it came to be that the power of the people was the first real substantive article after the general organizational article?
I can probably find it for you.
But is that the
Yeah.
way the 1984 charter wound up being adopted, or was it
Yeah.
rewritten later?
No, it was, I think it was adopted that way. We can check, and there was an interesting one too, is they switched the power of the select men and RTM. You know, they rearranged things, and they did start off with the power, then they couldn't decide, because it was power, they said, should be power of the people, power of the masses, power of the voters, and then they finally got, and it actually started powers and responsibilities, and the select board was responsibilities and duties. So they did have these discussions, and the one thing, so I can pinpoint it, in my thing, I can find it, because I think that they did that. But again, it was really weird because there were things that they spent so much time on, and then like, they would just, okay, we're gonna order it this way, so,
they did have some discussion about how referendum should work
in initiatives, yeah.
and initiatives and how many people they need and how many signatures you need to do certain things.
Yes.
And so they did talk about that, but not as much as they talked about other things. I mean, it was just kind of, well, they had one discussion or two maybe
Yeah.
on that.
And going to the, I keep saying select men, because it came up a few times where it'd be in the minutes, somebody would say, well, can't we change it to select person? And it was an absolute no. And so it was, and we have a classic thing that we're gonna read you when we get to the thing that caps, but it was, so there were discussion, I mean, there was a particular discussion about the powers and duties of the select men. But I can find when they organized.
I'll call it, but
I
I
was
have a
just-
question, but I want to follow up on that if I could.
Just-
You go ahead.
Oh, sorry, to your point about the specificity versus the general bit, there are some notes in here about that's what they were weighing.
Yeah.
And in terms of when you look at like select board powers, it has a very long list of powers. What you may not know is if you juxtapose that to the Title 24 of the Vermont statutes to talk about the selectmen's powers, it's a paragraph about yay big. And it just says you have just the general powers of running the town, but they don't, in that one section in the statute, enumerate all those powers. Those powers are found in all sorts of different sections of the statutes. And so I can see where that had been a debate of do we put them all in and be very specific, or do we just leave it broad? And same with the authority of the voters to overrule. When you look at like the statutes and the creation of ordinances, there's a section in the statute that allows a referendum. So I think that some of that gets borrowed and put into the charter.
Yeah, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not RTM could overrule the select board, which I thought was an interesting discussion to have. And there was particularly when they're talking about taking a property for public purpose. And they decided that only RTM could do that.
Is that even in the charter anymore?
No.
I don't think so.
remember reading it.
No.
Some of this stuff they decided, but then it came out.
Yeah.
They would fixate on something, and then at the end it would be, they fixated on traffic court forever. And then it was literally, I think, in 1983.
They took it out.
They took it out at the last second. I think the town attorney was like, okay, I guess I changed my mind on traffic court. And I go, oh my God, for like 3 years you guys have been
Talking about traffic.
So in terms of the structure, article by article, it sounds like you see it changed, but it doesn't sound like you're saying that there's a lot of discussion about why it happened.
No.
And it really was somebody, they'd say at the next meeting, hey, let's talk about Article 5, Section 3. And somebody, they'd go like, okay, David, draft it up and bring it. And so they draft it up, and there was never any back and forth like I agree or I don't agree. They never took a vote, this is one of the things, even at the end to say, we all support this charter, and you can go forward to the select board and say, there's no, it's really fascinating that it was sort of back and forth, and it was, somebody decided, oh, I don't like that anymore, okay. I mean, it's amazing that we have the document that we have, actually. You just,
Joy?
Forgive me for the question, but just so I don't stew over it, was RTM created in 80 or
No.
in the 60s, right?
I
50,
thought it was 1959.
Nine.
59,
Memory
something
serves
like
me
that.
correct.
yeah. And that's why there's talk in here too about putting it, whether to have an article about RTM or just
Just
refer.
put the statute in.
Yeah, put the statute in, so they ended up doing both. That's why there's a separate, like the powers of RTM laid out, and then it references the addendum that they put at the end. So they did both in this thing, but at first it was, well, we don't have to put it in, what do we put in? Referencing, because somebody was saying you're just duplicating, but there was other things.
It was also interesting, there's handwritten note from somebody saying, well, RTM was just created in Brattleboro because we didn't have a space that was large enough to have the whole town meet. So,
Yeah.
history of the creation of RTM is kind of misty.
Yeah. Yeah. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Any other questions right now? Milson?
Isn't there a later, I mean, this is 1980, did you
Yeah,
also do this?
there were revisions in, what, 96 and was
Somewhere in the 2000s.
2000.
in 2000
Couple
something.
of-
And are you planning on doing the same kind of exercise with those?
It has like a
We-
year by year.
or-
We don't have any information.
Well,
We
Pam's-
don't have a whole lot of information about those commissions. They didn't keep, I have one folder for each with very little information. So we have no records.
I mean, I'm very confident that the last round of charter revision focused extensively on the powers of the people.
Yeah,
And what, because I mean, I lived here,
yeah.
and I remember the discussion about the number of voters and signatures that were needed to get various items onto the agenda, and it was a big focus. And I recall Spoon at the very least, but
Yeah.
maybe Kurt too, but Spoon for sure was a leading member of that charter
Yeah.
review
Yeah, and
commission.
there was, like Peter's dad was on it.
Right.
And I think what makes this one sort of different than the other ones is this was like like 80 was a wholesale, you know, we're taking what we've got and we're doing this big changes to it. The things that have come up subsequently haven't been wholesale changes.
Yeah, and I talked to somebody who was on the 96 commission, and she said, well, we spend a lot of time cleaning up the language. We didn't, not a whole lot of substantive changes, but changing the pronouns. I think that's when they changed from select men to select board, was in 96.
And then the Larry Block era
That was Spoon, yeah.
and Spoon, they spent a lot of time, and there's no judgment in this, but philosophizing over the types of town governments, from mayor to select board to, you name it. But really trying to go through all the different examples. And when all was said and done, they came down and made various revisions, but it wasn't a wholesale change. But that was much more of a loftier thinking than cleaning up things.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, but we don't have any, this is a relatively complete record of what happened.
yeah. Well, I
We don't
think
have anything like that for
So
those
you're-
2 years.
It sounds like you're saying that you are surprised about how the lack of, agendas and so forth and public participation, and yet the subsequent ones, okay, they were less substantive, but there was even less participation?
Well, we
and
don't know.
documentation?
We don't know. We have no we don't have any real documents.
I would think that there's gotta be record
Someplace.
from 15 years ago, because that's what it was 15 years ago,
Yeah.
of the work that the most recent Charter Revision Commission did. And wherever that might be, maybe we haven't located it, but I have to believe that exists somewhere.
I can check next week too, in the planning department's vault. Might be a location for someone.
Jan or somebody would know
they-
where it is.
I know that Sue looked.
Yeah, she looked
So
for
what?
us, yeah.
But we could reach out to Spoon too, I mean, and Larry, he's gone. But
Yeah, we can have, there are people that were on those
Right.
commissions
Yeah.
that we can, I was just going to,
Go ahead, Bob.
Just as a housekeeping matter, I have to leave to get my daughter, but if there are issues with regard to items of legal research, if you would just note them or give them to Patrick, and that can be forwarded on to me so that for your next meeting, any legal issues that you may have, I can at least start on getting answers. I'm not sure if we're to that
I
specificity
don't think we're there
today,
yet.
but I
I
just
don't
wanted
think
to
we're there
mention
yet.
that since I have to leave early.
Because I have a hunch that
That's all we have for 96.
I have a hunch that what we'll do is we'll probably be moving towards trying to get an overview from VLCT about what other charters look like, and
Yeah.
that'll be the next stage in what we're doing before we start focusing on specific issues, so it'll be months before we're really.
Okay,
looking at
no, but I
specific
mean,
issues.
if something comes up, just let me know.
And we leave this box with Patrick, so, and if you want to refer to it for any reason.
Okay. No, this summary is great. Thank you, I'm sorry to have to leave early tonight.
We have there.
This is the 46th charter.
We're passing down.
That's it. So, if there's no more questions about that general history, then maybe you want to tell us about lessons learned.
Yes.
Okay, the first thing we've been talking about already is to make more provision for public input. You know, whether we do meetings where we have a Zoom component or publicize the agenda in advance, and I'm gonna talk about meetings in a minute. But, and post both the agenda and the minutes someplace where public can access them. And to that point, we thought we should have a page on the new town website. We need to invite more people, agency heads, elected officials, members of the previous charter commissions, members of town boards and committees, members of the public to provide input. You know, maybe we invite them to talk about a specific topic, or when we get to a specific place in the charter when we're working on that section. But we need to invite more people and have more people and make sure they come. We need to decide how we're gonna do the writing. Whether we're gonna, people feel comfortable taking sections. There's an issue with subcommittees. Two people can work together, but once you get past two people, then you run into the open meeting law. So I think we could have 3, is that right? We
We
have
really haven't broken up into subcommittees.
No, I know,
In
but
the
if
time,
we.
no, but not
but
only
if
here,
we
in other
go-
boards that I've been on.
Yeah, we
And
haven't.
I think that the consensus before was that we would try to work just as
As a
committee,
whole,
as a
yes.
who,
Yeah,
without breaking the subcommittees, and I think we talked about
Yeah.
that in a prior meeting.
we did. But the, whether we feel comfortable taking various sections or something that you're interested in and suggesting revisions. We think everything needs to be dated. Because we have miscellaneous pieces of paper, we have one folder with some miscellaneous pieces that, some we could figure out by the context when they happen, but others, we have no clue. And we want to keep a better record than other people did. And there's a new email address, charter@brattleboro.org.
That's live?
Yes. Patrick set it up, and anything, if you CC anything to that address,
Can you say it one more time?
it's charter@brattleboro.org.
Thank you.
And so my question about that was, do we want to advertise that and have public comments go there also? I think that's a question we should talk about. We need to involve the select board and local legislators more and more often. They met with the select board twice during this entire time. And I think we should plan on doing that more often and making sure that our local folks know what's going on, because I don't think there's, until we ask the final charter to be introduced, I'm not sure there's been any contact with any legislators.
Can I jump in on that? And
Yeah.
the reason it's important that we have the select board involved is because ultimately they're the ones that have to warn the vote on it. So we don't get to be the ones that say, it's done, let's have a vote. So we need their buy, you know what I mean? We don't want to wait till the last second and find out they hate this thing and we're dead. And the legislators are important too, because once the town votes on it, now we're at the mercy of what happens in Montpelier. So the more people we can get involved earlier, we're not gonna hit speed bumps along the way.
And they tried to meet every other week, which I think is not a bad idea for to keep the continuity up. I know there are times when we can't meet every other week, but, and we should try to focus each meeting on a specific topic. You know, the town plan, the town clerk, RTM, the duties of the select board, whatever. But once we finish going through and reviewing the charter, which I think we should probably do one more time, then we should start working out a long-term agenda and looking at sections and what we want to do.
They jumped around as you read these things. I mean, it was just like this ping-ponging.
Yeah, and we should, when we can't reach consensus, or even if we can, we should probably vote on revisions and have that in the record. And the final thing, and poor Patrick's gotta listen to this again. Don't write down anything stupid, or if you do, shred it before it gets into the record. There's a handwritten document dated January 4th, 1983, and I'm going to read it to you. It says, "What do you think of this? It would be added at the end of the glossary section." And this is the language they wanted added. "The masculine gender is used as a matter of style and for legal consistency. It is intended to include the female gender. We, the 5 white men who have drafted this document to preserve the patriarchy, would not for a moment intentionally discriminate against the girls in our community. We do this unintentionally as a matter of day-to-day operation, learned from years of experience and centuries of oppression over the weaker sex."
Yeah.
We don't know who wrote it, but
It has
it's,
a little official stamp of the day.
so don't write any. I don't think anybody on this commission's gonna do this, but
I know, it's a little like self-aware, but also like an intentional dig.
yes,
So it's,
Yeah.
yeah, against the girls.
Yeah.
Patrick thought we were really creative when we made that up ourselves, an example of what not to write down. We're not that creative.
That was special.
So that's what we have.
So we have all of the historical stuff, but not the lessons learned page.
I'm
You're
gonna
share
send
with us the
that.
lessons learned
Yes, I
page
will
too?
send that out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And we're gonna put, just so everybody knows, we're gonna have all these documents in front of all the years. If for any reason anybody's interested in looking at the documents, or if we ever want to refer to something again and go, well, what was this about? Everything is organized. You know, the one thing we've decided we're gonna do too is keep the records now so that we'll end up with a box like that for us, for, on our year.
You're taking charge of it because
Oh, yeah.
you have these
Oh, yeah.
documents, or?
No,
Yeah.
we've
Just-
become obsessed with making sure that
Okay.
this charter commission doesn't end up with just junk in a
One-
box.
Yeah.
Well, there's agendas and minutes for
Yeah.
these meetings, and they
Yes.
should be stored centrally. Patrick, you had your hand up.
Yes, sir. So I'm just sort of listening to what's important to everybody. One of the things I'm hearing very clearly, I believe, is you'd like a page on the webpage, on the website, where the meeting minutes and agendas can be, ordered. Am I correct in assuming all of these types of documents that are presented at the meetings you would like
Yeah.
included as well?
Yes,
Yeah.
Along with the lessons learned document?
yes.
Excellent.
That would be great.
Yeah, the only reason you don't have this is because we were working on it until late yesterday.
And it's dated, just so you know.
So I think the plan, as we developed it when we were talking about long-term agenda setting, was that we would try to do this background work to understand the history of the development of the charter, and then we would try to gather information about other charter structures and things that we can't do. And it's unfortunate Peter can't be here, but he was interested particularly in talking about other charters and then trying to get VLCT in here.
He did take the folder that we had, where, I don't know which year it was, but one year collected a bunch of charters. And I don't think it was this 80 to 84, I think it was probably 96 that collected a bunch of charters. And he has those and was gonna look through them.
And so I think that's the next step. And I'm not sure when we'll be able to organize the next meeting to have that additional background sort of discussion and presentation. Really, what VLCT would come talk with us about is something that I could communicate with them about, Peter would communicate with them about. He had some pretty clear ideas about that. And then I think the plan was to segue into going through the charter section by section, and then dealing with other topics that we're gonna be working through. So I think the plan will be, unless I hear a different approach, is we'll try to have one more sort of background meeting, give people the opportunity to look through what's in that box and any other materials we have about historical revisions. I think we wanted to have a discussion about how representative town meeting came to pass, and
And I'm gathering more info on that.
you are,
Yeah,
all right.
it's not
And-
easy to find, but.
And so we'll have those sort of one or two more background meetings, and then we'll just dive right in to going section by section to start inventorying issues that we want to review. And maybe we'll just take a section of the charter at a time, and then we'll begin setting out a list of action items to be working through. If anybody's got a different approach that they want to see, suggested or let me know, we'll work that in at any point. But that's what I've heard from our meetings. People thought we should be our organizational structure going forward.
I can take the little bit we have from 96 and do something similar to this. There's not much there, but I'll write up what we have.
And then these materials are available for anybody or everybody to go through between now and when we meet again or thereafter.
Yeah, Patrick will have them.
And I really want to thank the two of you. It's a huge amount of work that you all undertook, and it really helps to clarify how we got here. So I want to thank you very much on my own behalf and on behalf of everybody else.
Well, I want to give, like, even though we've sort of gone back and forth, the people that did this back in 80 to 83, I mean, what they did.
Was pretty
It was
remarkable.
pretty remarkable then. It was interesting, because some
Many
of
of the
the
yeah.
stuff is hilarious to read.
Many of the names are people who are no longer with us, right?
Right,
I mean,
exactly.
Mr. Burgess is no longer with us, Ms. Corum's no longer with us,
Dart Everett.
but Dart lives across the street from me.
Yeah, and Chris
And-
Hart might be helpful, she was the
Chris,
assistant town manager at the time.
And, you know, Bob Poo is still around,
Yeah,
so,
And they're
we
members
can
of
invite them.
the two more recent commissions that are around. That'd be
Right.
good to
Yeah.
invite.
So we might start reaching out to them too,
Yeah.
to just get some historical perspective from them
yeah.
about what they remember about the way the process unfolded and what was important to them. Maybe that's what we'll do for one of the meetings before we really dive in, is to try to invite them as well.
Yeah,
So when Peter comes up for air, I'll talk with him about trying to get VLCT and whatever ideas he had about looking at other charters, to try to bring that to us. And then we can start some outreach for yet another meeting with anybody who's willing to come from the prior revision efforts.
yeah.
So we have names of people from the 84, but if you can get us some names from the 96 and the one in the 2000s, that would be helpful too.
Yeah, and I think in 84 too, Chris Hart might be able to she could shed light on, did they have agendas? You know what I mean? And she might be able to shed light on the actual behind the
She
scenes
took a lot of the
stuff.
minutes that we have, Chris took.
And I would say, if somebody is does not know how to enter the process of this, these would be meetings to absolutely highlight to more attendees,
Mhm.
to the public, whatever way. And I don't know if we are personally allowed, if we have to wait for the warning first and then say an agenda's on this website, and then we can go into our own ways to lift it up to our neighbors and our colleagues to say, this is, like, you can hear from a live person and not just us, like, wandering in the darkness, you know, like, we'll end up on some other side together, I think. So I'm not sure what that means and looks like, and if, on what level it's actually allowed, if it has to be warned first, type of thing. But for folks who don't know how, like, for me, who doesn't know how to enter the process, that would be the meeting to attend.
Well, Kate wrote up a press release for the meeting before this one.
We should do it every meeting.
Should be for every meeting,
Yeah.
and if you're prepared to do
I'll
that.
do that.
We didn't have a press release for this meeting, but they run it in the community news.
I
And,
didn't think about it, though. I think I was too obsessed with
right,
this.
and it's not only that, but this all came together relatively
Yeah.
quickly. I mean, town meeting was upon us,
Yeah,
and we've just been very busy.
yeah.
We were talking about outreach through the website. We were talking about doing a mass mailing at some point. And there's certainly no prohibition on individual outreach to talk up the work that the commission is doing. The issue in terms of how agendas get structured and published is that I had an idea, for example, that maybe we could get to this meeting by the end of April. And then Jessica was on me saying, I need your agenda by X date. And so last Friday, I wrote out the agenda and I got approval from Kate, and then Jessica published it. But if we have a schedule, like Maya suggested, that's more dedicated.
Well,
it
even
will-
that, I think, will take some time. I think we need to hear from everyone first, because
Yeah.
as it was flushed out already, it sounds like at least 2 more history meetings or information meetings gathering because of the village and towns, and then also like from the previous members. So already it's expanding. So yeah, it would be difficult right now to be like, yes, we know exactly what's gonna be the next 12 months.
Right, but unless somebody disagrees, it seems to me that background information will be useful.
Yeah, we'll blast that out.
Before we go forward.
Yeah, but I think the public should know that we're having those people in
Yep,
too.
yep. And we'll do our best to try to draw people in.
Could I
Like I said, so
bother
far
you
it's-
then for the press release?
Oh,
Because
yeah.
I My consumption of information, I think, is different than others, and I will, while I am on the email, the newsletter, and I love seeing our stuff up top, like links right away for folks. I know there's a lot that gets buried down below. I'll be honest, I don't know that I've actually seen a public warning of a meeting, even though I attend them, and even though like I'm a part of committees.
Look
So-
in the meetings box in the Reformer. If you can look at the Reformer online or get the paper.
And there's a difference between a meeting warning and publicizing the meeting.
Okay.
Like legally, you have to post that the meeting's happening in 2 places. You know what I mean? Whether it's I think it's 2, whether it's the bulletin board or the Reformer. So that's sort of like the legal thing. But then there's what you're talking about, which is publicizing it, which we can go crazy on. You know, we can do Facebook, everybody can do their own thing. You know, when I write a press release, I'll make sure everybody gets it. So if you want to put language in, you know what I mean? So we can go crazy on that, and I think we should go crazy on that. You know, what you're saying. 'Cause
And
it's in
once
a
we
way.
get going and we get somewhat of a schedule, we can say that now that there's that monthly newsletter, we can say the 2 meetings or the meeting in whatever month will be covering X topic.
You had something you wanted to contribute?
I was only just gonna make note of, the town's got a growing and now actually fairly large social media presence, and we can put that to use with each of the meeting warnings, right? We're gonna have a particular topic, we can blast that out across fairly large and growing population of social media users and put that to use at the same time we're doing meeting warnings.
Yeah, see, I tell Millicent.
I think putting it out, telling the RTM, because those people are pretty engaged and will tell others.
Yeah.
And may I make one other suggestion?
Please, yeah.
Is that people that the, whatever you say about it includes kind of a short explanation of the meaning of it. Like if somebody just hears Charter Commission, it might not mean that much to them. This is like, I heard somebody else describe this as, it's like writing the Constitution for the town for the next 15 years. Hey, this is going to affect you. It's going to affect everybody. So really helping people understand the impact.
I'm also gonna note that there's a lot of different ways to chair a meeting. And unless somebody wants to see it done differently, I'm really trying to step back and not recognizing people individually, you know, but just having people contribute. So if you want it done differently, you'll let me know, but for right now, I don't wanna try to run that kind of control over a meeting. Any more discussion for tonight? I have a hunch it'll probably be 3 or 4 or 5 weeks before we're back together, because putting together the package of what's gonna be presented for the next couple of meetings will take some time. But I think probably at the second of those meetings, we'll try to start developing a regular schedule. We're going through portions of the charter and then topics separately.
Well, the League of Towns and Cities won't be able to come until after the legislature's over,
There we
which
go.
is the middle of May, right? Is that
So we're
when that-
moving towards there. Well,
Yeah,
that's
we're getting-
optimistic.
Yeah, at the
Yeah,
end.
May's next week.
Yeah. Next week.
End of May, sometime middle of June,
Yeah.
right? And I guess we'll also start thinking about inviting people to come and speak, and maybe we can do that for the next meeting to get people's overview
Yeah.
and perspective about what was important to them in the various charter revisions. Maybe we'll do that next. Cool. Anything else? All right. We're ready to adjourn. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Also, my address